Welcome to the Unknown Broadcast, where we come out of left field to cover all the bases. This is broadcast number 7, and our guest tonight is Dr. Calvin Beisner from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. That's a really long title, by the way. Tonight, we're talking about a call to protect the unborn and the pro-life movement from environmentalist deceit. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast.
Yes, this is Ron Hensel, and tonight's webcast is brought to you by, can you see that? It says I'm screen sharing now, but I'm seeing still the meme. Are you taking that down?
It's done.
Okay, we're brought to you this evening by World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop destination for dubious doctrines, half-baked heresies, and other notions whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet, and by Jack's General Deconstruction, the postmodern alternative to inconveniently clear thinking and frustratingly consistent interpretation. Jack's General Deconstruction. And now it's back to you, Don.
Yeah. Dr. Cal Beisner. We have a kind of a, how do I put this? We've known each other for a while, and to some degree, because of his late sister and brother-in-law, Bob and Gretchen Passantino, who I had the fortunate honor of knowing pretty well. We met at least a couple of times a year, speaking at various conferences and things. And Bob would tell me stories about Cal in his misspent youth, reaching Jehovah's Witnesses with Bob. And Cal has gone on to get his doctorate. And he now heads up an organization called the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Tell us a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance. What is it that you do, and why do you do it?
All right, great. The Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a network of evangelical Christian scholars. There are about 60 scholars in our network. Roughly a third of them are natural scientists, including climate scientists, by the way, because that's an important environmental topic nowadays. Roughly a third are economists and policy wonks. And roughly a third are theologians and philosophers. And I kind of fit in the economists and theologians thirds, but I've also done an enormous amount of the scientific reading as well, so it's hard to tell just exactly where I should be. We work together through our website, through publications, through articles, through speaking at churches and conferences and colleges and seminaries and schools and the like, to promote three things simultaneously. The first is what we call biblical earth stewardship, or godly dominion. We're using the word dominion there out of Genesis 1:28. Godly dominion is men and women made in God's image, laboring lovingly together to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth, to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors, so that really we're addressing the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. The second thing we try to advance is economic development for the very poor. And think in terms of places like sub-Saharan Africa or Haiti and certain parts of Asia and Latin America. And we consider, both on a biblical ground as well as on a historical and economic ground, that this economic development, this rising out of poverty, requires, first of all, a set of social institutions that we might summarize as private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, the rule of law. And then second, no society has ever risen out of poverty or can stay out of poverty without access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, especially in the form of electricity. And so we want to promote the understanding of and the embrace of those things for societies to rise out of poverty. And then the third thing that we try to promote through our educational work is the proclamation and defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. All of this we do in a world that's permeated by an environmental movement, most of whose worldview, theology, and ethics are anti-Christian, whether it be because they are atheistic, materialistic, or because they are pantheistic or panentheistic or animistic. In one way or another, their worldview is basically monistic. That is, they think that all reality is one. They deny the creator-creature distinction. And as a result, they wind up worshiping the creature rather than the creator.
Sure.
This is the worldview. Theology and ethics of the environmental movement tend also to be anti-Christian. They have their own doctrines of God, creation, humanity, sin, and salvation. And the environmental movement has been very intentionally infiltrating churches, greening the gospel, as they put it, so that the gospel becomes something like, if you love God, take good care of the earth. Now, yeah, it's true. If you love God, you should take good care of the earth. You should want to take good care of the earth, but that's not the gospel. You know, take good care of the earth is imperative, a command, and that's law. And Paul tells us in Romans 3 that by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. The gospel is indicative, and it tells not what God requires of us, but what God has done for us, because we couldn't do it for ourselves. The gospel, Paul summarizes in 1 Corinthians 15 as Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, buried, he rose again from the dead according to the Scriptures. And Paul tells us that this gospel is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. So we want to make sure that the churches understand that whereas godly dominion over the earth, a biblical environmental stewardship, is a good thing and a right thing, an awful lot of what goes by the name of environmentalism is actually quite different, especially because a lot of environmental work uses either very poor science or very poor economics, or both. And therefore, many of the policies really are not particularly helpful to the natural environment, but are very harmful to the world's poor. So
Well,
we're working on all those together.
And it is basically a religion. As you know, I was at the wow, we're getting terrible echo. Okay, that's gone. I was at the Parliament of the World's Religions in October, and the theme was environmentalism, the entire thing.
Yes.
The worship of Mother Earth. We've hurt Mom. We need to take care of Mom. Mom is now sick. And it came from nearly every quarter of the participants that were there. Oprah Winfrey had done a segment that was present. The Dalai Lama did a segment that was done by video. Al Gore's daughter was there. And there was really not a workshop or a plenary session that you didn't go into that raised this issue of humans have hurt the climate. Mom is sick. We need to fix Mother Earth. And 97% of the scientists agree that there is climate change and it's man-made. What is the response to that?
Well, first, in terms of your general statements about the religiosity of much environmentalism, that is quite definitely true. And it's obvious, not just, for instance, at the Parliament of the World Religions there, but you can look back at the founding of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment in the early 1990s, co-founded, interestingly enough, by the late Carl Sagan, the astronomer, Marxist atheist, right, who is a co-founder of a national religious partnership in the environment. That's a rather interesting understanding, right?
It is, yeah.
His co-founder on this was James Parks Morton, the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, who was a New Ager, baptized animals from the zoo, and all sorts of interesting things like this. So the religiosity is clear, and it's most certainly not a Christian or biblical religiosity because it denies the creator-creature distinction. And when it does that, of course, people think themselves to be wise because they become fools. God gives them over to a reprobate mind. And then they begin to practice all kinds of ungodliness, and it's not surprising. A great deal of ungodliness is closely tied to the environmental movement. Now, regarding that last point that you made, about 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real. We have to do something about it. It's a terrible, dangerous problem. Well, you know something? I think probably 100% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real. But not nearly 97% agree that it's mainly man-made. Perhaps about 52 to 60% agree with that. That's the better statistics on that. But even there, although perhaps 52 to 60% think that recent climate change has been mainly man-made, far fewer think that it is overwhelmingly dangerous, or even that it is net dangerous, that there are more harms than goods that come from it. And then far fewer tell us that, as Al Gore and others would say, that we need to be spending trillions of dollars trying to change our entire energy system in order to mitigate, to reduce our warming of the atmosphere by reducing our use of fossil fuels and replacing them with wind and solar so that we're not adding CO2 to the atmosphere. But the truth is that there is enormous debate among real scientists about this, real climate scientists, and the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation has two of the world's leading climate scientists among our senior fellows. Dr. Roy Spencer of the he's the U.S. science team leader for NASA's Aqua satellite remote sensing system for getting global average temperature from all over the world 24/7, 365, all altitudes, all longitudes, all latitudes. I mean, it's the best way we have of measuring temperature around the world, and he's the one in charge of that. And then Dr. David Legates, who's a professor of climatology at the University of Delaware. And then we have a number of other climate scientists and additional scientists with us. And we've worked with them to produce a number of really outstanding papers, and also recently a video. In fact, I'll show you here real quickly a brand new video that we've just put out called Where the Grass is Greener. Where the Grass is Greener. Biblical Stewardship versus Climate Alarmism. And this is interviews that we did. It's built out of interviews that we did with over 30 world-class scholars in this field. And it gives the case that, in fact, yeah, climate change is real. Of course, climate always changes. It always has changed throughout Earth's history. Human activity probably contributes something to it, but probably so slight that it's not even measurable. And certainly not dangerous. The total amount of warming that is alleged to have happened since 1850 is less than 1 degree Celsius. That would be the equivalent of about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Most locations on Earth have a greater temperature swing than that every day, from the middle of the night to the middle of the day. And they have much greater temperature swings than that from middle of summer to middle of winter. So that kind of a small change in global average temperature is certainly not going to bring any great harm to anybody. And what we do know historically is that people have thrived better in warmer times than in colder times. But climate, frankly, is not the chief threat for mankind. If you are even tolerably well off, like the lower middle class of America, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. If you're dirt poor, you can't thrive in the greatest tropical paradise. So poverty is a far greater risk than climate change, and so the call for us to fight climate change by reducing our use of the energy that is absolutely essential to deliver and keep people out of poverty is actually a call to make people more vulnerable, not less.
Yeah, which kind of brings us then to our kind of our theme for tonight. I hadn't really thought about this before I saw your article. By the way, for those who are viewing, we have in the showcase, which will come up on your right there, a number of resources that are available. One is linked to this article, Pollution and the Death of Babies. Another one is an open letter on climate change to the people and their local representatives, and the biblical perspective of the environmental
Stewardship.
Stewardship, yeah. Right to the Cornwall Alliance webpage, and I think that those would be very helpful to you. But this one was kind of intriguing. A call to protect the unborn and the pro-life movement from environmentalist deceit, a new declaration by pro-life leaders. I had never really put sort of environmentalism and pro-life even in the same sentence, much less the same thought. And so, what is it that you're I could go through and read the article, obviously, but kind of just in brief, what is it that you're saying? Are the environmentalists pro-life? Or are they not pro-life? Are they doing something that's somewhere in between, is actually creating harm to the pro-life movement? What is it that you want people to understand?
Yeah. Well, there is one particular evangelical environmental organization called the Evangelical Environmental Network that was founded actually as the evangelical branch of the National Religious Partnership on the Environment back in the 1990s. It started out of Ron Sider's organization, Evangelicals for Social Action, which is a pretty leftward-leaning organization. EEN, back in 2012, launched a campaign called Mercury and the Unborn. And in that campaign, they said, mercury emissions from power plants, coal-fired power plants, are putting American babies at risk. They said that 1 in 6 American babies was exposed to high enough mercury levels in the womb because of these mercury emissions to be at risk of, as they put it, devastating permanent brain damage. Now, actually, they were badly misreading the Federal Environmental Protection Agency's data about this. The EPA was actually saying that, if you read their work very, very carefully, that more like perhaps 1 in 1,000 infants was exposed, not to a level high enough to cause devastating permanent brain damage, but rather to a level that might cause a slowdown in neurological development that in most disappears by age 2, in almost all the rest by age 7, and in the very few in whom it persists, it amounts to the equivalent of about a half-point reduction in IQ, which of course happens even in identical twins raised in the same household. So it's not devastating, and it's almost never permanent, and we can hardly call it brain damage. But EEN was making this claim, and so they said, look, we're pro-life, we're against abortion, we want to protect babies in the womb. Well, we should protect babies in the womb by supporting the EPA's call for new restrictions on mercury emissions from power plants. And so for that reason, supporting the EPA on that became pro-life, right? This made you pro-life. And in fact, in their campaign, they lauded as sensitive to pro-life concerns members of Congress who supported EPA on mercury emissions, even though those members of Congress had 100% pro-abortion voting records. And then they castigated as not sensitive to those pro-life concerns members of Congress who opposed EPA on that, even though they had 100% pro-life voting records. So what happened really is they obscured the meaning of pro-life. They divided the pro-life movement, and they made it more difficult to elect truly pro-life members or candidates to public office. And at the time, over 30 leading pro-life movement leaders signed together a document, a declaration, repudiating what they were doing and saying that they should cease and desist. Well, EEN didn't, and just this year, they launched a new campaign called the Pro-Life Clean Energy campaign. And this is in support of EPA's Clean Power Plan, which requires a huge reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. And here the idea is CO2 emissions are causing global warming, which is putting people at risk. Therefore, if we protect them from that, it's called pro-life. But the problem is, that you cannot make a clear connection between added CO2 in the atmosphere and any harm to human life, but you can make a very clear connection between the use of fossil fuels to provide energy to lift people out of poverty and people's increasing health and life expectancy. So if anything, what they're doing is actually promoting the opposite of pro-life through this. And they're forgetting that there are some really essential ethical differences between abortion, which is what the pro-life movement really was founded to oppose, and that's what the term actually meant. It was coined to depict those or to denote those who are anti-abortion. In abortion, you intend, in every single abortion, you intend to wind up with a dead baby. The result is death, and the intention is death, right? With the use of fossil fuels, the intent is to provide the electricity and other energy forms that meet all kinds of human needs for refrigerating food to keep it from spoiling and making people sick, for running the MRIs and lights and everything else at the hospital that keeps people well. When you make electricity out of fossil fuels, your intent is to enhance human life, not to harm human life. Now, is there a byproduct? Yes, there are byproducts of all sorts of different activities, and some of those byproducts are some pollution, right? But we've already learned how to burn fossil fuels in a very clean way as far as preventing really dangerous pollution, but now they're saying CO2 is a dangerous pollutant because it promotes global warming. But again, there's not the intent to harm people. It's a byproduct. And ethically, the two just are totally distinct.
I need to stop you there 1 second. What is CO2 for the average person? What is CO2 actually?
Well, that's a great question, partly because a lot of the other side intentionally tries to obscure what we're talking about here. You've heard of carbon footprints, right? And we're supposed to make sure that we have a small carbon footprint. We're told that we want to reduce carbon emissions from electric generating plants. We want to reduce carbon pollution in the atmosphere. Well, when people think of carbon, they have a tendency to think of black soot. It's fine, dusty particles. And you know what? If you breathe that stuff in for very long, get a lot of it into your lungs, it can be very hazardous to your health. But that's a solid, and carbon is an element. Think back to the days even in elementary school, where you studied the periodic table. Well, carbon is an element, and it's a solid. Carbon dioxide is not an element. It's a compound, and it's a gas. It's an odorless, colorless gas. You and I exhale carbon dioxide when we breathe. When we inhale, we take in a combination of oxygen and nitrogen and the various other things that are in the atmosphere, plus carbon dioxide today at about 40 parts per million. That's 40 parts per million, or 40 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere that we breathe in is CO2. When we exhale, we're breathing out 40,000 parts per million carbon dioxide from our bodies. But plants take in carbon dioxide. Plants have to have carbon dioxide in order to grow. In fact, if the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere drops below about 175 parts per million, plants can't grow. They die, and then everything else dies as well. And before the Industrial Revolution, the average CO2 concentration around the world was about 280 parts per million. At that level, plants were sucking air, so to speak. They were barely making it. Now, with CO2 up to about 400 parts per million, plants are doing much better. The whole Earth is greening because of this. Deserts are shrinking. Plants are growing at higher and lower altitudes, warmer and cooler temperatures, making better use of water. They're better, more resistant to diseases and all sorts of things. So added CO2 in the atmosphere is actually a very good thing. CO2 cannot become harmful to you until it reaches a level of over 10,000 parts per million and stays at that level for a long time. Our submariners in the Navy operate at levels like that for long periods of time. So CO2 is not a dangerous pollutant. It's absolutely essential to plant life. The more of it there is in the atmosphere, the better the plants grow. The better the plants grow, the more food there is for everything else. And that's most helpful for the poor around the world.
All right. I think Ron may have a question, although we're having a little echo problem. Ron, do you have anything you want to say? I don't know if you can even hear me. Are you there, Ron?
Hello, Ron?
Huh. Well, I can see his picture, but I don't see him moving any longer, so I don't know what that means. So we'll continue on and hope he rejoins us.
Yes.
Okay, you were talking about how things differ. Just let's go back over that again. The ethical differences between abortion and pollution. As you outline this, you say the intent differs. Tell us again what that means again.
Right. The intent differs. In abortion, the intent is a dead baby. Right?
Right.
And that's what you get in every abortion that's successful. Right? Whereas in the use of fossil fuels, the intent is energy to enhance people's lives. And the unintended byproduct is some pollution that comes while you make that energy. And that pollution can be harmful to human life. However, the benefit of the energy far outweighs the harm of the pollution. And we know that precisely because historically, as societies industrialize, as they begin to use more and more machine energy instead of human and animal energy, and that machine energy requires that they have electricity that comes mostly from fossil fuels. Around the world right now, 87% of all energy used is from fossil fuels. As societies industrialize, at the very same time that air pollution rises, human health and longevity also rise. People are healthier and they live longer, which means that the benefits of the energy that they get exceed the harms of the pollution. And then, as they begin to reach even fairly low levels of economic development, they can then afford the more expensive technologies that harness that energy while reducing that pollution, and you wind up actually with a cleaner environment than you had before. Think for a minute, if you're in New York City around the year 1900, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of horses all over New York City. Think about the air quality and the quality of the streets that you walk on. Yeah. All the manure, all the urine that they produce, right?
There's still a lot of manure in New York, I have to admit.
Well, yeah, but that's awful. Now, the introduction of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, and the automobile essentially took the horses away from New York City and other cities all over the place. The result was much cleaner air. And that was because we switched from animal energy to energy from fossil fuels.
Okay. I had a friend. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
That group you mentioned, EEN, Evangelical, what is it called? The EEN group. I forget
Evangelical Environmental Network.
Do any people in the pro-life movement take them seriously, would you say?
That's hard to tell. I do know, for instance, that 4 years ago, over 30 pro-life leaders around the country, including people like Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council and Charmaine Yost of Americans United for Life and various others, top leaders in the pro-life movement, signed on to the declaration that castigated EEN for its Mercury in the Unborn campaign. I do know that EEN tends to send people to march in the annual March for Life in Washington, D.C. I don't question that they are themselves personally opposed to abortion. My point is that they're trying to equate opposition to mercury emissions, or rather support for the EPA on mercury emissions, or support for the EPA on CO2 emission reductions, with being pro-life is really to obscure the meaning of pro-life and to divide the pro-life movement. Another thing that happens, frankly, is that you get a lot of young people who think, oh, gee, wow, I can help the pro-life movement by helping this environmental organization. I can march to reduce global warming, and that helps the pro-life movement. And the really sad thing there is that not only does it not actually help the pro-life movement, but there is a huge connection between the environmental movement as a whole, and particularly the global warming alarmist movement on the one hand, and the population control movement on the other hand. You know, if the idea is that human use of energy is causing rising CO2 emissions, which are causing dangerous global warming, and we must reduce total CO2, well, we might do that by reducing how much CO2 each human being emits. But another way to do it is to reduce the number of people emitting CO2. And so, for instance, Jeffrey Sachs of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon are strong proponents of population control, and at the same time they're strong proponents of climate change alarmism. And the sad thing is that when people latch on to the notion that we need to have population control, that leads to government family planning programs, which in many developing countries around the world tend to include government coerced or even forced sterilization and abortion, as in, for instance, China's one-child policy that it had from the early 1980s till just a little less than a year ago. They raised it to 2 children around most of the country. But the real fact is that those who jump onto the global warming bandwagon at the same time wind up embracing the population control bandwagon, and that leads to more abortion around the world. So it's a sad irony.
Mm-hmm. Ron, you have a commercial break for us here? Uh-oh, his mic's off. Try it again.
Oh, is my mic back on now?
Yes, you are on.
I'm trying to cut down on whatever echo effect we're getting by keeping my mic turned off. But it is about that time, you're right, Don, for a word from our friends at World's End Theology Outlet. You know, and they want you to know that Al Gore has been wondering, and perspiring minds want to know, whatever happened to all that water from the movie Water World? Well, you know, it didn't go away. From World's End's Holy Relics Department, we have it. We have it now. It is bottled for you, now available for a limited time. Holy water for the new age. Sprinkle it on climate change deniers. Sprinkle it on fellow activists. Sprinkle it on tofu or whatever. We have the water. It's waiting for you. The water from Water World, only for a limited time from World's End Theology Outlet. And if you're asking for it, it's probably too late. Back to you, Don.
Water World. You better order it quickly before it evaporates.
Well, also, you know, there's that Al Gore doomsday clock thing that will probably render the whole thing moot. Yeah. But in any case, yes, for a limited time. I've always wanted things to sprinkle on people, and I think this is the ideal gift for people who need that kind of thing.
I love it. Are you up for helping us to market that, Cal?
Well, I'm not real good at marketing, but hey, if you'll send me a bottle of it, let me try it first, and then see if I'm willing to do an endorsement.
I love it. We have endorsing things here. By the way, this is I maybe shouldn't do this, but sometimes I can't help myself. This is completely unrelated to any global warming. Well, no, actually, it could be a global warming issue, now that I think about it. Some years ago, Suzanne Hinn, Benny Hinn's former wife, did a whole thing on stage about those who had spiritual constipation. I don't know if you saw that.
No.
And so she recommended that you get a Holy Ghost enema. And so we have Suzanne Hinn's Holy Ghost enema, the only enema to use if your engine is not revving up, and endorsed by Suzanne Hinn. Things are just too weird.
That seems to me more like blasphemy of the Holy Ghost.
Well, it's
I think it is
heading in that
blasphemy of the
direction.
Holy Ghost. Go ahead, Ron.
I said it's heading in that direction. I have my own personal climate change story, maybe a little bit similar to yours. I don't know. Do you still live in Florida, Dr. Beisner?
I do. I live 17 miles from the beach in South Florida and 8 feet above sea level. So if Al Gore was right in saying that sea level could rise 60 feet in this century, I should already have gone from 8 feet above sea level to perhaps just about 3 feet above sea level or 4 feet above sea level by now. But in fact, it hasn't changed at all. I'm not worried about it, and neither is he. By the way, he bought a condo in a building that is right at the waterfront in San Francisco. So he apparently doesn't believe his own hype.
Well, and I think it started snowing the day he moved in there, didn't it? Anyways, the thing is, I moved down to Florida in 2002 from the Chicago area, and I had been listening to stories on climate change for years by that time. I'm still a frequent listener to NPR, and it struck me that the stories I heard in the 90s were not nearly as hysterical and not nearly as angst-ridden as they became in the early 2000s. And I remember even hearing a climate change scientist in the 90s say, well, I mean, think of all the farmland that'll become available in Canada, I mean, there are going to definitely be big upsides to this, and we'll be able to feed a lot more people and all this. And suddenly something turned, and I think it was the Al Gore phenomenon. He became the what do you call it? The sky is falling. The high priest of hysteria. And I remember as we closed on our house down here in 2003, thinking to myself, what have I done? I mean, what is my son going to inherit here? Now that he's down here, I mean, we're going to be beachfront property, or we're going to have to move further inland to get away from the beach. That's the way they were portraying it. I thought, we're talking within a couple of decades, all this real estate investment I've just done will be totally worthless. Yeah. And I like the way you began that sentence. I should have been, have water in my kitchen by now. I remember a few years later, as I started teaching middle schoolers, I remember saying, I should have died 5 times by the time I was 40. I should have been killed off by a nuclear war, by a biological war, by air pollution, by water pollution, by you name it. By the hole in the ozone layer. Should have died of skin cancer. Every few years they gave me a new thing that I was threatening my existential being. Yeah. And suddenly I thought, okay, I'm not going to be fooled again. And guess what? They fooled me again. And as I started looking into it, I started realizing, and I was so proud of myself, Don, for not falling for all that Y2K stuff. And yet I was concerned about climate change until I really started noticing that there really are bona fide scientists with real degrees in the field. This is what gets me. 97% of scientists believe climate change exists and is man-made, and yet when you look at the list of scientists they put out there, a lot of them aren't even in the field. We're talking like astronomers. They believe it's man-made. Any comments you might have on that?
Well, they're probably, as my friend Roy Spencer, who is a senior fellow for the Cornwall Alliance, he is principal research scientist in climatology at the University of Alabama, and as I mentioned earlier, he is the U.S. science team leader on NASA's Aqua satellite program for remote temperature sensing all around the world, 365, 24/7, 365, all latitudes, all altitudes, all longitudes. Roy Spencer points out that really there are probably no more than, perhaps a dozen climate scientists who actually have the expertise to do the kind of physics and modeling necessary to try to estimate how much warming you get from addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. And among those, if you track their publications over the last 15 years or so, what you see is that their estimates of the warming effect of adding CO2 to the atmosphere are falling lower and lower and lower. And the reason for that is fairly simple. The computer climate models that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others rely on for their predictions of global warming from human emissions of CO2, those climate models, they're very, very sophisticated, but of course, as with every computer program, garbage in, garbage out. There are all kinds of different things about the climate system that we simply don't understand. We don't even, in some instances, we don't know whether a climate feedback, a response to a change in temperature at the surface of the Earth, is positive or negative. That is, whether it causes more warming or less warming, let alone do we know how big it is. And so when you get to those scientists who are actually working on that question, it's called climate sensitivity, their estimates are falling and falling. And the reason is this. On average, those computer models predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually observed over the relevant period. Worse than that, 95% of them predict more warming than actually observed over the period. Now, that's particularly important because if their errors were random, they would be as frequently below as above the observations, and by roughly the same amounts. But instead, they're 95% above, and by 2 to 3 times the actual observed warming over the period. That means that the errors are not random, but they are driven by some sort of bias, whether it's a bias of everybody's making the same mistake and doesn't realize it, that that mistake is written right into the models, or a bias of, well, some people are actually intentionally putting things into the models that result in higher warming predictions. I don't know the answer to whether it's honest or dishonest bias, but that it's bias is clear. And then finally, none of the computer models predicted the fact that there was no statistically significant global warming from essentially February of 1997 until December of last year. That's almost 19 years. Now, that's just simply not possible to reconcile with the computer models. So they've realized the models are running way too hot. We have to revise our understanding of how the whole climate system works. And when we do that, our estimates of warming from added CO2 plummet to much, much less than the 3 degrees from doubled CO2 that was the IPCC's best estimate, to now the estimates are running anywhere from 0.3 of a degree to about 1.75 degrees Celsius. And nobody finds those to be dangerous. In fact, most estimates are that those would be very helpful to all life on Earth.
Sure.
Well, I have a question to follow up on this.
Hold on one second, Ron. I want you
Sure,
to
go ahead.
1 second. For those who are viewing, if they want to send in a Q&A question, we're open to that. Just type it in, send it in, and we will respond. Okay, Ron.
You said something that's extremely important, and we hear this again and again, especially you hear it from, I don't know what to call them, skeptic sources, let's call it that. You rarely hear it from non-skeptic sources, that there has been little or no, there's been no real statistical climate change of mean global temperatures going up in the last 15 years. Or more? Is that about right?
More like 19.
19. Okay. And yet we keep on hearing year after year the hottest summer on record or the hottest year on record. Now I've looked into it. I think I have an answer to this question, but what is your response? I mean, when I put these two things side by side, uh, it, it I stand back and I say we are really in a war here, aren't we? There is an information war, or
Yeah.
what we used to call back in the Cold War days, a disinformation war. When the Soviets would put out what we called disinformation to counteract any truth telling that might come out of the West. That's what it strikes me as being.
Yes.
One of these sides is engaging in disinformation. What do you have to say about that?
Well, yeah, I think there is a lot of disinformation. There's a lot of dependence on, I suppose we could call it the innumeracy of most people. We are all familiar with illiteracy. That's people who don't know how to read, right? Well, innumeracy is people who don't know how to think mathematically, right? Now, let me simplify something for us here for just a minute. Suppose that you're out hiking and you're ascending a slope and you reach a plateau and you walk along that plateau and you haven't reached a place where you start going up again, you haven't reached a place where you start going down again. As long as you're on that plateau, every step you take will be tied for the highest elevation you've reached in your hike, right? Does that mean that you're still getting higher? No, right? Now suppose that in the midst of that, you step up on a rock. That's a little higher than you were, so that's the highest you've been all along. Now you step down off that rock, you're not there anymore. Well, climate change or changes in global average temperature run cyclically. The world is always either warming or cooling. Long-term stasis is essentially never happening, right? We're always going up and down. Now, when people claim that, for instance, as President Obama claimed in June of 2015, that 2014 was the warmest year on record, well, most people thought about record and they thought, oh, gee, that's got to be hundreds of years, thousands of years, maybe millions of years, if you believe the Earth is that old, right? Well, no. The record that was in mind there was the record kept by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which goes back to 1880. That's 135 years, right? 135 years. Well, furthermore, that record is highly questionable because it depends on surface-based thermometers, which are not spatially representative around the world, and which have all kinds of problems in how they are located, how they're maintained, how they're read, and all. Their data are very unreliable. The best data we have are those gathered by satellites, and that record goes back to 1979. Okay, just 1979, so that's 37 years now, right? Now, 2014 was tied for the third warmest year on record, according to the satellite data. 1998 was the warmest, and 2010 was the second warmest, according to the satellite data. However, here's what's really crucial. This is I'm drawing this from Dr. Richard Lindzen, who is one of the world's top climatologists, emeritus at MIT, and Lindzen just points out, by the way, it really doesn't matter. We look at these things and our response should be, so what? Because the total difference in temperature between, say, 2010 or 2000 or 1998 or 2014 on the one hand, those three warmest years, and the next 10 warmest years is smaller than the margin of error in measurement. So we really don't know which of them is warmest. Any of them could be. But far more important than that, the total difference, not just among those 10 warmest years, But between those 10 warmest years and the coldest years of the last 135 years, that total difference is a small fraction of the typical change in temperature that happens every day at any location around the world, and a smaller fraction of the typical change in temperature that happens between the middle of summer and the middle of winter at pretty much any location anywhere around the world. It simply doesn't matter.
But isn't the point when they stress the global average temperature, and if that keeps on edging up, isn't their point that as the average goes up, the extremes go up? They go ahead.
That's their claim. That's a very common claim. However, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its special report on extreme weather back in 2012, very explicitly said that it was impossible to make any connection between rising global average temperature and an increase in either the frequency or the severity of any severe weather events. And, by the way, what we've actually observed is a decline in global cyclonic activity. That is what's called the cumulative cyclone energy index each year. That has actually fallen over the period of modern. Likewise, the number of F3 or above tornadoes in the United States has declined. The percentage of the country that is in drought at any given time has declined. All sorts of different things. There is no way to tie global warming to an increase in the frequency or the severity of any severe weather events.
I just did one of those F3 tornadoes.
Let me add one more thing here.
Okay.
let me add one more thing here. Severe weather events are affected by the movement of air between the tropics and the poles, the polar regions. But that movement of air is affected by the difference in temperature between the polar regions and the tropics. All right? Now, as the global average temperature rises, it rises more at the poles than it does toward the equator, which means that the difference between the polar temperature and the equatorial temperature shrinks. With that shrinking difference, you have less movement of air between the two, which means you actually can predict less severe weather rather than more.
So then it really boils down to concern over rising sea levels, what impact those will have on supposedly vulnerable places like the Maldives Islands, things like that. People who already want us to pay them trillions of dollars, they're already getting ready to sue us in world courts in order to get in on the take here. Maybe we can just buy some carbon tax credits or something and pay them off that way. I don't know. Have them plant a few trees, but is that really what it's boiling down to? Just the rising sea levels now? Is that all they have left?
Yeah, that is becoming their chief concern and their chief claim. However, the actual empirical measurements tell us that there has been no increase in the rate of sea level rise over the period of so-called modern warming. And there are a number of different reasons why this would be so. But first off, we need to remember that sea level has been increasing ever since the end of the Ice Age, roughly 18,000 years ago, depending on what geological theories you happen to embrace. But SLR, sea level rise, has been fairly steady throughout this period since the last Ice Age. And there's no evidence of an increase in the speed of that rise in sea level during the modern warming period. Now, part of why that's so, we've just recently seen a new study come out, and at the moment I've forgotten the source, but it was some major university that completed a study that showed that because with a slightly warmer world you increase evaporation, you also increase rainfall, and when you increase rainfall, you increase the recharging of aquifers on land. And so we're actually storing away more water underground because we're pulling more water out of the lakes and streams and, most importantly, the oceans. And so that offset the rate of sea level rise. But also, when you have more precipitation, you have the collection of more snow and ice in the polar regions. And that means that you're keeping that part out of the oceans. The gist of it all is that the empirical measurements, as distinct from the modeling that the alarmists use, the empirical measurements say that there just is not the problem to be dealt with. And if you will let me here for just a moment, I'm going to give you another recommended source here. Now, this is huge. This is a big book, all right? This is one volume out of 3 of the Climate Change Reconsidered 2, done by the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. Now, you could buy this for, I think it's about $150 on Amazon, or you can get it, you can read it for free at their website, nipcreports.org, nipcc.reports.org. This is the work of true empirical scientists who are showing that the best evidence shows that these claims of disaster are simply false.
So you could download, is it a PDF file on their website?
Yes, it is.
And so you can download that to your tablet. I love PDF files. You can download them to a tablet and read them, you know, if you don't mind reading a book on a tablet,
Sure.
instead of just sitting at your computer. And you can make an evening's read out of that, it looks like. Knock it off in a couple of nights?
Several evenings, yes.
They're running out of things.
What was that web address again?
Yeah, what's the web address?
nipcc.reports.org.
N is in non-governmental, right?
Right. Non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change. nipcc.reports.org.
nipccreports.org.
Right.
I'm going to go to that website. So they're running out of things to scare us with. Okay, it's, you know, they're running. Okay, they can't scare us with hurricanes anymore because we've been kind of noticing for the past 10 years since Hurricane Charlie went just a few miles west of my house back then, and I was huddled inside my inner room. They had predicted it was going to go all the way. It wasn't going to make landfall till Tampa, and then the next thing I know, it's coming right up the Caloosahatchee River near me. And then the next thing I know, no, it's not doing that. It's going around up into Port Charlotte, but that was still pretty close. They can't scare us with that because, you know, it's been pretty quiet around here, in case you haven't noticed, for the past more than 10 years. They can't scare us. They're going to find it more and more difficult to scare us with extreme weather claims, with rising sea level. So is that why they're now trying to like link global warming to everything from terrorism to Trump's presidential campaign? Is that why they're doing this?
Well, yeah. In fact, the Obama administration is now saying that global warming is causing risks to national security because of mass immigration going on from places that are suffering from climate change. Well, as a matter of fact, there's been no documented mass immigration from anywhere, and the only person who ever attempted to lay a legal claim to having been forced to move his residence because of climate change was a man from Tuvalu in the Pacific who said that he had to leave Tuvalu because of rising sea level, and he went to the World Court for this, and the World Court turned him down because, as a matter of fact, it turns out that Tuvalu has not been experiencing rising sea level. Neither have any of those other South Pacific islands that everybody claims are going under the waves. Now, there is such a thing as land subsidence. That happens in some places, but sea level rise has not been threatening those places. And by the way, those places are coral atolls. They're coral islands, and corals grow faster than sea level rise occurs, so they can stay above sea level. Anyway, this is the deal. It's to frighten people into accepting government control over their lives. And you know, if government controls our use of energy, Energy goes into everything we do, making food, clothing, shelter, transportation, education, communication. Everything we do, we use energy. If the government can control our use of energy, it can control our lives.
But is it still worth a shot? Is it still worth a shot for me to hire Morgan and Morgan to find some kind of link between my receding hairline and global warming?
You know, I'm sure you could do it. There is a website, and at the moment I can't remember it, but you could Google for it and find it fairly quickly. But it lists all of the different things that have been blamed on global warming, and it includes things like increased prostitution rates in certain places, or decreased fertility of turtles in some places, or you know, you name it. It's quite amazing.
Well, on a more serious note, and this is really serious to me, and I am almost incensed. I am almost incensed when I think about it. Every time I think about it, and that has to do with the what's been known as ClimateGate.
Yes.
And I have read very, very extensively on this, and I kind of consider myself not an expert, but a fairly well-informed layperson. And as far as I'm concerned, Michael Mann should be prosecuted. Now, that's just my personal opinion. This does not reflect the opinion of Midwest Christian Outreach Incorporated or any of its subsidiaries.
Okay, but for those who are watching, what is climate change, and who is Michael Mann?
Yeah.
Michael Mann, University of Pennsylvania at the time, I think. He's the guy who wrote the email, and he was like the #1. There you go, the hockey stick illustration. Which, if you look at that hockey stick there, which was he created that basically for Al Gore in his movie. If you look at the left of that.
Okay, hold on one second, Ron. Tell us what this is that you're holding up, Cal.
This is A.W. Montford's book, The Hockey Stick Illusion: ClimateGate and the Corruption of Science. It's about a 500 or so page book that is probably the most in-depth study of ClimateGate that's been published in book form. There have been some bigger ones done online, actually, but it's a really thorough one. And ClimateGate was the release in November of 2009 of about, if I remember correctly, about 5,000 emails, plus some computer programs and the documentation with those programs from the University of East Anglia's Climatic Research Unit in East Anglia, England, which is the center of a lot of the global warming alarmist scientific work. And what these emails revealed was that roughly 12.5 people at the center of the UN IPCC and the whole global warming alarmist movement have been, shall we say, exaggerating data, suppressing contrary data, making data up out of whole cloth,
as far as we can
intimidating scientists who seek to publish contrary views, corrupting the peer review process for publications, for journals, and even getting a journal editor fired because he had the temerity to publish a paper, a very fine paper that questioned what the alarmists were saying. So they've corrupted the whole scientific process, and the result has been a huge blot on the reputation of science. I think it's a really tragic thing because science is a very fine thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's a gift of God. God, the rational God, made an orderly universe to be understood by rational human beings made in His image, and science is part of how we do that. But when we corrupt science the way ClimateGate did, the way these men did, then we actually undermine people's trust in real science.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we have a conspiracy in the media. It is not necessarily the kind of conspiracy that happens when they get together behind closed doors and say, okay, here's what I'm going to say, here's what you're going to say. But it is a definite collaboration, let's put it that way, of journalists who are saying, nothing to see here, folks.
Yeah.
What? No, they didn't lie. No, it's been misunderstood. But it's very clear that that hockey stick illustration downplays, using to allude to or to refer to Mann's famous "hide the decline" statement. Well, there was a millennial warm period, a period of
Medieval.
millennium ago, the first millennial warm period. We know this is one of the most documented historical facts, even before there was such a thing as climate science, even before there was such a thing as meteorology. Even we knew that the first 1,000 years of the last two were warmer. That it got warm. It got very warm. We know that they were growing grapes in what is now Newfoundland. We know this.
There
We
was a
know
time when
that there
Greenland
was a
was
mini.
green.
What's that?
There was a time when Greenland was green.
We have documented. We have records in our histories of this. This is something that's been established a long ago. There was, and then we had something that's been called a mini ice age, or a very cold period, in which in the 16 and 1700s, the glaciers were advancing down the Alps so fast that in some communities there, they were holding prayer meetings begging God to halt the advance of the glaciers.
Yes.
And so the glaciers that we all thought were there forever and ever really weren't. So there's this deliberate, in my opinion, deliberate misrepresentation of the history of our climate, and it's designed to do what you say, to achieve some kind of government control over resources. I don't see any other interpretation.
You know what? We are almost about 10 minutes over, and Cal was down sick today, so we don't want to keep him any longer than he needs to. Do you want to make just a kind of final statement, Cal, before Ron gives us our final wrap-up commercial?
Well, I think as Christians, we need to be sure to bring in biblical understanding to these things. I mean, it's great to argue the science, and we should. We need to do that, and we need to do it very carefully. But I think we also need to make sure that we're founding our thinking biblically. And one of the points that I like to make for Christians regarding the fears of dangerous man-made climate change is that I think that the whole thing really is almost an insult to God. And here's why. The Bible tells us that an infinitely wise God designed, and an infinitely powerful God created, and an infinitely faithful God sustains the earth and all its systems. And it tells us at the end of Genesis 1 that when he finished creation, he looked at all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, according to the dangerous man-made global warming meme, so to speak, human emissions of CO2 threaten ecological catastrophe by raising global average temperature. But what are we looking at here? We're looking at bringing CO2 from 28 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere to today 40 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. And if we ever reach a full doubling of the pre-industrial level, 56 thousandths of a percent of the total atmosphere. Now, who in his right mind thinks that increasing CO2 from 28 thousandths of 1% to 56 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere is likely to cause the whole climate system to go into utter chaos? You know, if you have an atheistic worldview in which the earth and everything in it is the result of blind chance over time, then it makes sense to think of the whole thing as, boy, this must be really, really fragile. It just got together this way by accident, but boy, you perturb it a little bit, you can mess it up. But if you have a biblical worldview where this omniscient, omnipotent, and faithful and good God made and sustains this world, then you can't think quite that way. Now, that doesn't mean we ignore empirical investigation. But it does mean that we perhaps ought to have our thinking caps on. We ought to take really seriously what Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things, hold fast what is good. And when my friend Roy Spencer, the climatologist, really was thinking about this, and he thought about Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And he thought, this whole notion that we're going to cause rapid warming by this tiny change in atmospheric chemistry doesn't make really much sense to me. I wonder, we must be misunderstanding how something in the climate system works. And that was what spurred him to begin studying how clouds respond to changes in temperature at the surface of the Earth. The climate models all assume that clouds respond to a little bit of warming in a manner that results in more warming. Roy set up a series of of experiments that he could conduct using the satellites of which he has control under NASA to see exactly how clouds respond to changes in temperature on the surface of the Earth. And what he found out was that they do the exact opposite. When the temperature at the surface of the Earth rises a bit, clouds change to minimize that warming. When it falls a bit, clouds change to minimize the cooling. Clouds are really a thermostat. And that's a wonderful illustration of God's wise planning of the climate system. So as Christians, we need to think these things through very carefully. That's what we do at the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. In particular, your listeners might want to go there and click on the look at our most recent major paper on this was called A Call to Truth, Prudence, and Protection of the Poor 2014. And that's a thorough paper by two outstanding scholars and then reviewed by a bunch more scholars before we published it. So it's a peer-reviewed piece. And then in addition, I would urge that they get hold of our new video called Where the Grass is Greener, Biblical Stewardship versus Climate Alarmism. That is available through our shop online. And we have a lot of other items available as well. One that we've just put out and is not yet in our online shop, but it is called Fossil Fuels, the Moral Case. Fossil Fuels, the Moral Case. And this really gives the moral argument for why we need to resist the clarion call to reduce our use of fossil fuels, because the result of that will be to make energy more expensive, which means it will be less available to the poor around the world. And yet no society has ever risen out of poverty, and no society can stay out of poverty without abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And at this point, fossil fuels are our best source of that.
All right. Okay. Ron, you're on.
Well, one thing I would just add to your biblical case for God's faithfulness in sustaining the planet that we live on, you refer back to the beginning of Genesis, but one day, as I was discussing this with a Christian friend on Facebook, she just said, this is all ridiculous because God promised in Genesis 8:22,
Yes.
after the flood, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And that is a promise of regularity, a promise of predictability. Obviously, it doesn't preclude disasters occasionally, but we're talking about there overall, as time goes on, we're always going to have seasons. We're always going to have a time when we can plant food, when we can do these things. There will not be any huge changes of the hysterical kind predicted earlier, a couple of decades ago. And as soon as I saw that verse, I thought, wow, how did I miss that? It was just, to me, that's an amazing verse from an evangelical point of view, in terms of how much should evangelicals get involved in this, and how alarmist should we be? Well, if we have these kinds of promises in Scripture, well, not very, in my opinion. We need to be much more cautious before becoming a Chicken Little or joining all the other Chicken Littles of the world. So is it time, Don, to start wrapping this thing up here?
It is
okay.
time.
Well,
final word from the sponsors, and then we are going to be out of here.
Okay. I I think we're on here. Let's see. Yes, we want to hear from our friends at Jack's General Deconstruction, which is the postmodern alternative to inconveniently clear thinking and frustratingly consistent interpretation. Are you impressed by absolute truth claims? Do you wish you could use just any text to prove just about anything you want? Well, then Jack's General Deconstruction is for you. All of Jack's work comes with free logocentrism inspection, free binary opposite inversion, free destabilization of textual meaning. Jack deconstructs everything, including his estimates, which are free, or are they? Subverting the best to palm off the rest since 1966. Jack's General Deconstruction. Back to you, Don.
Okay. And next week, we are going to have Dr. Norman Geisler talking about the battle for inerrancy. The battle for inerrancy. That will be next week. Cal, I thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, even though you are struggling with the flu that I had 2 weeks ago, and being with us. So everyone, check out Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and there is a ton of information that is available for you to help confound your friends and neighbors with what they don't know about the climate. Thank you, Cal. Ron, talk to you next week.
Thank you.